So tonight we're going to talk about the things that I take into consideration when I am choosing a font. That is my first car, and it is a 1983 Dodge Verada given to me by my grandmother. Water pump went out the very first time I drove it. When I started thinking about type, for some reason I started thinking about the first time I drove, the process of learning how to drive. And I'm in a car, never done this before. My mom is really gripping the oh shit bar pretty hard out of my peripheral vision. And my brain is going, right? Like I'm checking the side mirror, I'm checking the rearview mirror, I'm looking down at the speedometer, which one's the brake, which one's the gas. The gears are turning really quickly. And if you had done a brain scan of me at that time, I bet you would have seen a lot of activity up here in the front of the brain. We're not going to go into neurology, but for sake of argument, we'll just call it the conscious brain. And the thing about the conscious brain is, it gets tired pretty easily. 30 minutes of driving at age 16 or 15. I was shocked, right? But you fast forward to today and I can talk on the phone, eat a donut, drink coffee, and drive at the same time, although please, it's not safe, and I do not recommend that you do that. However, if you scanned my brain while I was driving now, I think what you would see is a lot of activity back here in the back brain. We'll just call it the automatic brain for the sake of argument. And of course, with the automatic brain, works effortlessly, right? So what does all this have to do with type? Well, we're going to do a test, and I want you guys to take a look at these letters up here on screen and see how easy they are to read. All right, thank you. And now we're going to go to the next slide, and I want you to do the same test. Was one of those easier to read than the other? Which is first one? First one was easier? All right. Second one not as easy? All right, so if we go here to the following slide, we're going to talk about some fonts, and we're going to talk about other fonts. Some fonts require the frontal lobe to engage. And when that happens, you get tired of reading a lot quicker. Other fonts, automatic. You don't even have to think about it. If you're reading a good book and the pages are just turning, you're using one of the other fonts. So, of course, if you're using some fonts, people read less. And if you're using other fonts, people read more. I am going to argue that type is both an art and a science, and the art of type is style. The science of type is legibility. And we're going to talk about both of those tonight. In breaking down type by legibility and style, I get 4 categories. So let's unpack those categories. Up top, text fonts. Next we got display fonts, decorative fonts, and then finally what I call never fonts. Let's take a look at some examples. Text fonts, books. It's got to work for pages and pages of type, and it's got to work at small sizes, from 6 to 14 points. Display fonts, still legible, but not as legible, more concerned with grabbing your attention. They have to work at larger sizes. And then we've got decorative fonts. These are highly stylized. Legibility is sacrificed for the purpose of really conveying an emotion, a feeling. And then finally we have never fonts. I have chosen curls to represent never fonts. I don't think it's a designer's place to go out in the world and say never use this font. But I think as a designer who uses type, you should develop that sense for yourself. So tonight we won't be talking about decorative, because that's something that you guys won't need any assistance with. But we will talk a lot about text and display, because it's taken me a long time to gather all this information about legibility, about history, the kind of dense stuff that Bringhurst writes about. So that's what we're going to unpack tonight, issues of legibility and style. And we're going to start with legibility. Legibility is not like a house. It's not like you got one room with all the legible fonts and another room with all the illegible fonts. It's more like an apartment building. Top floor, easy to read. Bottom floor, not so easy to read. And then plenty of floors in the middle. So I think it's important to remember that legibility exists on a continuum. If you look up top here, Minion is the font that I'm using for most of this presentation. Really easy to read. Helvetica, we'll talk about it later. It's pretty legible. Cooper, which is the example we used earlier, that's going to take more effort, more of your conscious brain. All right, what makes the font legible? Well, to start with, we're going to explore two fonts, and they are Times New Roman and Le Monde. They were both developed for newspapers, the Times of London, Le Monde of Paris, and we're going to talk about two type designers. Stanley Morrison, a legend in the field of type, finished, he actually supervised the project, but he finished that around 1931-32, and at the time, all the best research they had said that Times New Roman was a highly legible font. 60 years go by, Jean-François Porchet has a lot more contemporary knowledge. He says, all right, I'm going to take a look at what Morrison did with Times New Roman, and then I'm going to improve on it with what we know today. A lot of what I'm going to teach you tonight, I learned from Jean-François. He was the instructor at the Cooper Type program where I designed the typeface. All right, on the left, we have the lowercase e of Times New Roman. On the right, we've got Le Monde, and they look pretty similar. Biggest difference being the tail down there on the end. So let's take a look at that tail. What happens with the tail, and you can flip us to the next one here. This tail comes up, and it starts to invade this open space, whereas that tail continues to move forward and leaves more open space. This open space is called a counter. We're not going to get into names of type tonight because that's really tedious, but all you need to know is when there's more open space, it's easier for the eye to recognize, okay, this is where the black ends and the white begins. And when you're dealing with type of small size, you want to make it as easy as possible for the eye to see something very small and fuzzy as it's scanning blocks of letters and say, all right, that's either black or that's white. That's where that stops and that's where that ends. So, open counters, aid legibility. Oh, maybe we got a fancy graphic for it. All right, I think next we're going to explore, so here's an example. At this size, really small text size, I've just got C's, E's, and O's. And probably from the back it's getting pretty difficult to see the difference between the three of them. So you can see how important it is to really distinguish the shapes. Counters help with that. Now we're going to look at the lowercase o. And specifically, we are going to look at the axis of the lowercase o. And on the next slide you're going to see that this axis is closer to horizontal. Le Monde, the new font, axis is closer to vertical. What does that do? Well, when you read, your eye is always going from right to left. And when you have a stronger angle, that helps your eye move from right to left. Because what the eye is doing is it's looking down, it's grabbing blocks of letters, and it's trying to recognize a pattern, recognize a pattern, recognize a pattern. When the letters are moving to the side, it helps the eye to move to the side, and it speeds things along. So our lowercase o, in the case of Le Monde, is going to aid in legibility. Now I've got two Shakespearean sonnets. I want you guys to take a look at these and see if one or the other is easier for you to read. I'll just give you 10 seconds to look at it, and then I'll ask for a show of hands there. All right, now, who thinks that this example here on... Yep, all right, we got some hands. And who thinks that that example there? All right, we got some hands. Now let's flip over the card and see what we have. Gill Sans, Helvetica. You see these typefaces all the time. Highly common typefaces. Eric Gill designed Gill Sans, and he was a stone cutter. So he really came to type design with a firm understanding of how to carve old school, beautiful letters into stone. Helvetica, Max Niedinger, based on Swiss design with its emphasis on the grid. So a much different philosophy behind how you build a letter. So let's unpack these guys. First we're going to look at C and E, and we're going to take the lessons that we learned with Le Monde and apply them here. So this C has a much more open counter. because the terminals are moving sideways, as opposed to Helvetica, which completes itself and closes off that counter. Second, when you look at the tail on the E, in Gill Sans it's moving forward, helping the eye move. In Helvetica it's moving up, and it kind of takes your eye back into the letter. Not as easy to read. Now we're going to look at the G and the Q. Highly different shapes in Gill Sans. Almost identical in Helvetica except for the tail. Your eye has to work harder to distinguish the shapes, especially at small sizes. So again, Gill Sans is going to aid legibility with this 3-story G instead of the 2-story G that you see over there in Helvetica. And then finally, we're going to look at the lowercase a's. These circles that I have on the letter indicate what type designers call contrast. And that is the difference between the widest part of a letter and the narrowest part of a letter. And contrast helps us in the same way that open counters help us. It gives the eye a clearer picture of where the black part ends and the white part begins, so it's just a little bit faster to pick up on the distinction and it can move on. This is a pretty, I would call this a medium contrast, which is what you want. That's a low contrast. High contrast actually ends up being difficult on the other side for the eye to distinguish. If there's too much contrast, that can also cause problems. So contrast is a Goldilocks phenomenon. We want to get it just right there in the middle. Now that we've done legibility, take a look at some stylistic considerations. And the first one that I wanted to talk about, this is a big one, is print versus screen. Type designers will design for very specific use cases. For example, the phone book. Back when phone books were a big deal, you've got 7-point print. It is on terribly cheap paper with ink that's coming off of a fast-moving machine, and that ink bleeds through that paper like crazy. So I believe it was Tobias Frere Jones, formerly of Hoffler Frere Jones, before they had their famous divorce and spat. He designed a typeface that had where let's say you got a D, this might be a B for you, and you got the bowl here. This space where the bowl meets the stem just had all the corners taken out, so that when the ink bled, it would fill them in. So type can be designed for very specific uses. If we take a look at the next screen, you'll see 2 types that work. Minion, which I'm using and is working pretty well, I think, on the screen, was actually designed for print, and it was designed specifically to be printed at 12 points. So that's very specific. That's a type designer who knows exactly what he is trying to do. This is a font by Robert Slimbach, designed at Adobe. On the other side of the screen, you see Georgia, which was designed by Matthew Carter specifically for the screen. In the early days of computers, when screen resolution was a lot worse than it is today, he started with pixel grids, built the letters from those pixel grids, so that he knew even at small sizes that type was going to work really well on screen. Country of origin. I was looking for a good case for this, and I found one that I love. If we take a look at the Louis Vuitton branding, there we go. We've got the beautiful monogram, and then down here we've got Louis Vuitton. We're going to blow up that word mark, and that is Futura. Excuse me. And Futura is a German font. It was designed in 1927. And the man who designed Futura, whose name is going to escape me because I'm talking to you about him, was thrown in jail by the Nazis. Nazis said, "This is subversive." They put him in jail. A couple days later, he gets out of jail. A couple years later, the Nazis start using Futura on most of their printed matter. That's a long and complex story. We won't go into it. But here's the funny thing about Louis Vuitton using Futura. French brand. What happens in 1940? Nazis take over France. Hitler walks into Paris, takes one grand look at it, says, "Okay, now you can burn it down." Tells his generals literally to burn the city of Paris. His general knew that it was a great city and actually refused Hitler's order. But I wondered, why would Louis Vuitton adopt a font used by a man who wanted to burn down the city of their birth? Well, here's the backstory. The Vuitton family worked secretly behind the scenes with the Nazis when the Nazis came in and took over Paris. So for them, there is no conflict of interest. The corporate brand now, Louis Vuitton, Wyne Hennessy, has said, you know, that was in the past. This is now a corporation. We don't have anything to do with that anymore. But I thought that was an interesting historical anecdote, and it just goes to show